Move. What kind of disabilities do you have?
He's deaf and he's got cerebral palsy.
It kind of feels funny and my knuckles now smaller. Hand behind your back!
The fundamental promise of American policing rests upon a simple premise: that officers will investigate before they act, verify before they accuse, and protect before they harm. In Phoenix, Arizona, on August the 19th, 2024, this premise collapsed entirely when two officers transformed a routine disturbance call into a violent assault on a disabled man whose only crime was existing in public while black and deaf. The case of Tyron McAlpin represents not merely a failure of individual judgment, but a systematic breakdown of every safeguard that should prevent such encounters from occurring. What happened to him was not an accident. It was the predictable result of a system that prioritizes speed over accuracy, force over communication, and assumption over investigation. The initial call that set these events in motion concerned a white male named Derek, who was causing a disturbance at a Circle K convenience store. He was being aggressive. He refused to leave. He was the subject of the complaint. When officers Benjamin Harris and Kyle Sue arrived on scene, they had a clear mandate: address the behavior of the individual about whom the call had been made. This is the fundamental unit of police work. Respond to the complaint. Investigate the circumstances. Resolve the situation. What happened instead reveals the corrosive influence of racial bias on law enforcement decision-making. Derek, the actual subject of the disturbance call, pointed toward Tyron McAlpin and made accusations. He claimed McAlpin had tried to steal his bike. He claimed McAlpin had punched him. And these accusations emerged from a man who was himself the reason police had been summoned, a man whose credibility should have been immediately suspect, given that he was the one causing problems. A reasonable officer, trained in basic investigative procedure, would have recognized the need to verify these claims before acting on them. There were witnesses inside the store. There was surveillance footage. There were multiple avenues for establishing whether Derek's accusations had any basis in reality. Instead, the officers made a choice that would alter Tyron McAlpin's life forever. They chose to believe the white accuser without verification. They chose to pursue the black man without investigation. They chose to leave behind the actual subject of the complaint in favor of what the transcript chillingly describes as a more interesting target. This language, whether spoken aloud or merely reflected in the officer's actions, encapsulates the racial calculus that infects too many police encounters. The white man causing a documented disturbance was left to wait. The black man walking away from the scene became the priority. The decision to pursue McAlpin without first establishing the validity of Derek's claims represents a fundamental violation of investigative protocol. Police officers are not supposed to function as enforcement arms for any citizen who points a finger. They are supposed to gather information, assess credibility, and make reasoned judgments about where probable cause actually exists. In this case, the officers possessed no independent evidence that McAlpin had committed any crime. They had only the word of a man who was himself behaving problematically. Yet this was sufficient to trigger a pursuit that would end in violence. Tyron McAlpin, at the moment the officers began their approach, was engaged in one of the most ordinary activities imaginable. He was walking across the street while FaceTiming with his wife. He was not fleeing. He was not acting suspiciously. He was not engaged in any behavior that would suggest criminal activity to a reasonable observer. He was simply existing in public space, using his phone to communicate with a loved one. For a deaf man, video calling represents a primary mode of communication, the visual equivalent of the voice calls that hearing individuals take for granted. His attention was on his wife, not on the police vehicle that was about to change his life. The officer's initial approach set the tone for everything that followed. Rather than attempting to establish communication through non-threatening means, the officer drove directly in front of McAlpin and began issuing verbal commands. This approach presumes that the subject can hear, can process spoken language, and can respond accordingly. For approximately 90% of the population, this presumption might be reasonable. For Tyron McAlpin, who was profoundly deaf, the commands were meaningless noise, if he perceived them at all. The officer interpreted non-response as defiance. In reality, it was disability. The speed of escalation from first contact to physical violence defies any reasonable standard of police conduct. Within seconds of encountering McAlpin, the officer had initiated physical confrontation. There was no attempt to use visual signals. There was no attempt to write a message. There was no attempt to assess whether there might be a reason for the apparent non-compliance. The officer's training, if it addressed communication with disabled individuals at all, was abandoned in favor of immediate physical dominance. The body that stood before him was not a citizen to be communicated with, but an obstacle to be overcome. The violence that followed was not a proportional response to any threat McAlpin posed. The footage shows officers punching a man who was not fighting back in any meaningful sense. McAlpin's defensive movements, raising his hands, attempting to protect himself from blows, were interpreted as aggression rather than self-preservation. This interpretive framework, in which any movement by a suspect is classified as resistance, allows officers to justify virtually unlimited force. If protecting your face from punches constitutes assault on an officer, then there is no action a citizen can take that will not be weaponized against them. The deployment of tasers against McAlpin added electrical torture to the physical beating he was already receiving. Tasers are classified as less lethal weapons, but this classification obscures their capacity to cause serious injury and death, particularly in individuals with underlying health conditions. McAlpin suffered from cerebral palsy, a condition that affects muscle control and coordination. The introduction of electrical current into a body already compromised by neurological disability created risks that the officers either did not consider or did not care about. Their priority was control, not safety. Throughout the initial assault, officers repeatedly shouted commands for McAlpin to put his hands behind his back. These commands were issued with increasing volume and aggression, as though the failure to comply stemmed from unwillingness rather than inability. The officers interpreted his non-response as defiance, as resistance, as justification for continued force. In reality, McAlpin could not hear a single word they were saying. He was being beaten for failing to obey orders he could not perceive, punished for a disability he could not control, brutalized for the crime of being deaf in America. And the arrival of backup officers didn't introduce any element of de-escalation or reassessment. Additional personnel simply meant additional force being applied to a situation that was already characterized by excessive violence. The institutional response to perceived resistance is always more force, never reflection. The question of whether the initial approach was flawed, whether the suspect might have legitimate reasons for non-compliance, whether the entire encounter might be based on mistaken premises, none of these considerations enter the calculus once violence has begun. The momentum of force carries itself forward. The physical position in which McAlpin found himself, on the ground, with multiple officers on top of him being struck and tased, represents the nadir of citizen police interaction. He was helpless. He was in pain. He was unable to communicate his circumstances to the people who were hurting him, and he was entirely innocent of the accusations that had prompted this encounter. Derek's claims would later prove to be false. McAlpin had not attempted to steal anything. McAlpin had not assaulted anyone. The entire violent episode was predicated on lies told by the actual troublemaker, lies that the officers accepted without verification because they confirmed existing biases about who commits crimes and who deserves suspicion. The cerebral palsy that McAlpin lives with affects his ability to control his movements, to coordinate his limbs, to respond physically in the ways that officers expected. When they commanded him to place his hands behind his back, they were demanding an action that his disability made extraordinarily difficult, even under calm circumstances. Under the stress of being beaten and electrocuted, with his body in pain and his mind in terror, compliance became essentially impossible. Yet the officers continued to interpret his physical struggles as willful resistance, justifying continued application of force against a man who couldn't give them what they demanded. The false narrative that would emerge from this encounter was already being constructed in the officers' minds as they subdued their victim. In their version of events, they had encountered a combative suspect who fought with police, who bit an officer, who required significant force to bring under control. This narrative bore no relationship to the reality of what had occurred. The unprovoked attack on a disabled man who could not hear, could not comply, and could not fight back in any meaningful way. But police narratives have an institutional weight that citizen accounts rarely overcome. The power to define what happened belongs to those who hold the weapons. In the arrival of Tyron McAlpin's wife at the scene, introduced information that should have immediately transformed the officer's understanding of what had occurred. Here was a woman who could explain that her husband was deaf, that he suffered from cerebral palsy, that he had been on the phone with her during the entire alleged incident at Circle K. She possessed direct knowledge that contradicted the accusations upon which the entire violent encounter had been premised. A police force committed to truth and justice would have recognized this moment as an opportunity to reassess, to acknowledge error, to begin the process of making things right. Instead, the officers responded to this information with dismissal and hostility. The wife's explanation that her husband was deaf and that she had been communicating with him via sign language through video call was met not with understanding but with skepticism. The officer's response, questioning how a deaf person could use a phone, revealed a stunning ignorance of disability accommodation in the modern era. Video calling technology has transformed communication for deaf individuals, allowing real-time sign language conversation across any distance. This is not obscure knowledge. It is basic awareness of how millions of Americans navigate daily life. Yet the officers treated it as an impossibility, as though the wife were fabricating an explanation rather than describing reality. The institutional refusal to accept exculpatory information once an arrest has been initiated represents one of the most troubling patterns in American policing. Officers become psychologically invested in the correctness of their actions. Admitting error means acknowledging that the force they deployed was unjustified, that the injuries they inflicted were unnecessary, that they have harmed an innocent person. This admission carries professional, legal, and psychological consequences that officers are strongly motivated to avoid. The result is a phenomenon researchers call commitment escalation, the tendency to double down on initial decisions even as contradicting evidence accumulates. The wife's attempts to communicate with her husband from across the police perimeter illuminate the cruelty of standard crowd control procedures when applied without consideration of individual circumstances. She was told to stay back, threatened with arrest if she crossed an arbitrary line, treated as a potential threat rather than a crucial source of information. Her distress at seeing her husband on the ground, struggling to breathe, clearly in medical crisis, was treated as a management problem rather than a humanitarian concern. The officer's priority was maintaining control of their scene, not addressing the suffering they had caused. The information that McAlpin could not breathe should have triggered immediate medical concern. Respiratory distress in a person who has been subjected to physical violence, electrical shock, and prone restraint represents a life-threatening emergency. The phrase, "I can't breathe," has taken on tragic significance in the lexicon of American policing, associated with deaths that occurred when officers ignored or dismissed such statements. McAlpin's wife, recognizing the danger her husband faced, pleaded with officers to acknowledge his medical needs. Her pleas were largely ignored in favor of continued focus on restraint and control. The officers' concern for their own minor injuries, while ignoring McAlpin's serious medical condition, reveals the hierarchy of value that operates in too many police encounters. One officer worried about his knuckles, possibly broken from delivering punches to McAlpin's body. Another officer had allegedly been bitten during the struggle. These injuries, the natural consequences of attacking a man who could not understand what was happening, received immediate attention and sympathy. McAlpin's profound suffering, his inability to breathe properly, his terror and confusion were secondary considerations at best. The decision to proceed with arrest, despite the mounting evidence of mistaken identity, demonstrates the self-perpetuating nature of police violence. Once force has been used, officers need charges to justify that force. The assault and battery they inflicted on McAlpin becomes legitimate only if McAlpin can be classified as a criminal who deserved such treatment. Thus, the initial false accusation from Derek transforms into charges of assaulting a police officer and resisting arrest, charges that exist only because the officers attacked an innocent man, and he instinctively tried to protect himself. The victim becomes the perpetrator through the alchemy of police report writing. The charge of assaulting a police officer applied to a deaf man with cerebral palsy who was attacked without warning while walking down the street represents the pinnacle of legal absurdity. The assault in question consisted of McAlpin's involuntary defensive movements as he was being beaten. The resistance consisted of his physical inability to comply with commands he could not hear. These charges were not descriptions of criminal behavior, but retroactive justifications for police violence. that they were fabrications designed to transform the officers from aggressors into victims, to shift blame from those who held power to the one who had none. The presence of body camera footage in this case serves a dual function. It documents the violence while also capturing the officer's apparent lack of concern about being recorded. This comfort with documentation suggests either that the officers believed their actions were justified or that they expected the institutional review process to protect them regardless of what the cameras captured. Both possibilities are troubling. The former indicates a fundamental misunderstanding of constitutional policing. The latter indicates a system where accountability mechanisms have become so weakened that officers no longer fear them. And the Americans with Disabilities Act mandates that law enforcement provide reasonable accommodations for individuals with disabilities during all interactions, including arrests. This requirement exists precisely because disabled individuals are disproportionately vulnerable to police violence. They may not be able to hear commands, understand instructions, physically comply with demands, or communicate their circumstances. The failure to accommodate these realities is not merely a policy violation, but a civil rights issue with profound implications for equal protection under law. The Phoenix Police Department's treatment of McAlpin violated not just his individual rights, but the broader framework of disability protection that Congress enacted to prevent exactly this kind of harm. The requirement for de-escalation in encounters with individuals who may be experiencing crisis or disability has been recognized as essential to constitutional policing. Officers are supposed to slow down, assess, communicate, and seek nonviolent resolution wherever possible. The encounter with McAlpin represented the opposite of this approach. Officers escalated immediately, assessed incorrectly, communicated not at all, and resorted to maximum violence within seconds of contact. Every principle of crisis intervention, every training module on disability awareness, every policy guidance on use of force was abandoned in favor of brute physical dominance. The racial dimension of this encounter cannot be separated from its other elements. Research consistently demonstrates that Black Americans face disproportionate police violence across virtually every metric. They are more likely to be stopped, more likely to be searched, more likely to have force used against them, more likely to be injured, and more likely to be killed. The decision to pursue McAlpin based on an unverified accusation from a white complainant fits a pattern that civil rights researchers have documented for decades. The benefit of the doubt that might have been extended to a white citizen walking down the street was not available to a Black man in the same circumstances. The intersection of race and disability in McAlpin's case created a compounding vulnerability that the officers exploited rather than accommodated. Black disabled individuals face discrimination along multiple axes, encountering both racial bias and ableism in their interactions with institutions. Police officers who might have exercised patience with a white deaf person, who might have recognized the signs of cerebral palsy in someone of a different race, allowed their assumptions about Black criminality to override any impulse toward accommodation or care. McAlpin's body became a site where multiple forms of oppression converged with devastating results. The initial false accusation from Derek, the white man who was actually causing the disturbance, was never investigated, never verified, never subjected to the scrutiny that should precede any use of force. Store surveillance footage, had anyone bothered to review it, would have shown that Derek's claims were lies. Witnesses inside the store could have testified that McAlpin had not assaulted anyone. But the officers never sought this evidence because they had already found their target. The black man walking away from the scene satisfied their need for a suspect. An investigation was unnecessary once violence had begun. The booking of McAlpin, despite his obvious disabilities, despite his wife's explanations, despite the lack of any credible evidence of wrongdoing, completed the transformation of victim into defendant. The criminal justice system now had him in its grip, and extracting himself would require resources, time, and luck that many defendants do not possess. The 24 days he spent in jail before making bail represented not just a deprivation of liberty, but a continuation of the trauma that had begun on the street. He was incarcerated for the crime of being attacked by police. The legal proceedings that followed Tyron McAlpin's arrest revealed the institutional mechanisms that typically protect officers from consequences while subjecting their victims to continued punishment. The preliminary hearing, designed to assess whether probable cause existed for the charges, became a forum for officers to present their version of events under oath. Their testimony, captured and published, provides a window into the cognitive distortions that allow police officers to genuinely believe they acted appropriately, even when their actions were manifestly wrong. Officer Harris's testimony regarding his initial approach demonstrates the lack of reflection that characterizes so much police conduct. When asked whether he had checked if McAlpin had headphones in, he admitted he had not noticed. When asked whether he had tried to wave McAlpin down rather than shouting, he acknowledged he had not. When asked whether he had considered any reason why McAlpin might not be responding to verbal commands, he confirmed he had not. These admissions reveal an officer who made no effort whatsoever to establish communication before resorting to force. The possibility that his commands were not being received never occurred to him, or if it did, he dismissed it as irrelevant. The officer's description of McAlpin raising his hands as an aggressive act as preparation to punch illustrates the interpretive framework through which police view civilian behavior. When an officer approaches with violence and a citizen raises their hands, the officer sees preparation for combat. The possibility that the gesture represents surrender, confusion, or self-protection does not register. This perceptual bias has been documented extensively in research on police psychology. Officers are trained to identify threats, and this training creates a lens through which all civilian behavior is filtered for danger signals. Innocuous actions become threatening. Defensive movements become attacks. Compliance becomes resistance. When directly asked whether it was possible that McAlpin had raised his hands to protect himself from punches rather than to deliver them, the officer could not bring himself to acknowledge this obvious alternative explanation. He retreated to the language of body language and communication, as though the specific positioning of hands contained unambiguous information about intent. This refusal to consider alternative interpretations, to admit that he might have been wrong, characterizes the defensive posture that officers assume when their conduct is questioned. Admitting error is functionally impossible because it would require acknowledging that the violence they inflicted was unjustified. Officer Sue's testimony regarding his chokehold on McAlpin introduced new elements of concerning conduct. The image of an officer's arm wrapped around a prone man's throat evokes the deaths that have resulted from similar restraint techniques. When confronted with photographic evidence showing his arm around McAlpin's neck, Sue's response was to quibble about definitions. He suggested that a chokehold requires two arms from the same person, as though the number of limbs involved rather than the restriction of airway determined the danger. This legalistic hair-splitting, attempting to find technical distinctions that excuse obviously dangerous conduct, exemplifies the bad faith that characterizes officer testimony in use of force cases. The initial judicial determination that probable cause existed to proceed with criminal charges against McAlpin represents a failure of the system that is supposed to serve as a check on prosecutorial overreach. The judge heard testimony from officers who had brutalized a disabled man based on false accusations, who had ignored his wife's explanations, who had charged him with crimes consisting entirely of his involuntary responses to their violence. Yet the court found this sufficient to move forward. The burden of probable cause, already low, proved no barrier to the continued prosecution of an innocent man. The system designed to filter out baseless charges allowed this case to proceed. The 24 days McAlpin spent in jail awaiting bail represent a form of pretrial punishment that falls disproportionately on those who cannot afford to buy their freedom. For a man with significant disabilities, incarceration presents challenges that able-bodied defendants do not face. The lack of accommodation for deaf inmates, the difficulty of navigating an unfamiliar environment with cerebral palsy, the trauma of confinement for someone already traumatized by police violence. These factors compounded the injustice of McAlpin's situation. He was being punished not for any crime, but for his inability to immediately purchase his release. The intervention of Maricopa County Attorney Rachel Mitchell, who personally reviewed the body camera footage and decided to dismiss charges, introduced an element of individual conscience into a system that typically operates through bureaucratic momentum. Mitchell's decision to meet with senior attorneys and community members to actually examine the evidence rather than rubber stamping the officer's version represents the kind of prosecutorial discretion that should be routine but is actually rare. Her recognition that the charges were unsupportable, that continuing prosecution would compound injustice, demonstrated that accountability is possible when officials choose to exercise it. And the statement from Mitchell's office acknowledging the decision to dismiss carried implicit recognition that the charges should never have been filed in the first place. This recognition, while welcome, raises questions about the systematic factors that allowed prosecution to proceed as far as it did. How many other innocent individuals, without the public attention that McAlpin's case received, remain trapped in a system that criminalizes their victimization? The answer is unknowable precisely because their cases proceed without scrutiny, their stories untold, their suffering invisible. The public outcry that followed media coverage of McAlpin's case demonstrates the power of transparency to shift institutional behavior. The NAACP, the ACLU, disability rights organizations, and state legislators all demanded action once the footage became public. Governor Katie Hobbs called for enhanced training on disability awareness. The chorus of official condemnation created political pressure that the criminal justice system could not ignore. This dynamic, where accountability requires public attention that most cases never receive, reveals the contingent and inadequate nature of police oversight. Justice should not depend on whether a case goes viral. The placement of Officers Harris and Sue on paid administrative leave represents the standard institutional response to documented misconduct. They continue to receive their salaries while the investigation proceeds, insulated from financial consequences, regardless of what they did. This practice, while defended as protecting officers from premature judgment, effectively guarantees that even the most egregious conduct carries no immediate cost. The officers who brutalized McAlpin have experienced no punishment. They have faced no deprivation. They have been granted paid vacation while their victim recovers from trauma they inflicted. The ongoing investigation by the Professional Standards Bureau follows protocols that have historically resulted in minimal accountability for officer misconduct. Internal investigations are conducted by colleagues of the officers under review, creating inherent conflicts of interest. The standards applied are those of department policy rather than constitutional law, allowing technically compliant conduct that still violates civil rights. The timelines extend for months or years, allowing public attention to fade before findings are announced. Even when investigations find violations, the range of consequences typically falls far short of what civilian defendants face for comparable conduct. The civil lawsuit that McAlpin has filed against the officers and the department represents his remaining avenue for obtaining some measure of justice. Civil rights litigation under Section 1983 allows victims of constitutional violations to seek monetary damages and injunctive relief. The burden of proof in civil cases is lower than in criminal proceedings, and the officers cannot claim ignorance of the rights they violated. The case will force disclosure of training records, policy documents, and prior complaints that might reveal patterns of misconduct extending beyond this single incident. Discovery in civil litigation often reveals institutional dysfunction that departments prefer to keep hidden. The Department of Justice investigation into the Phoenix Police Department, referenced in coverage of this case, provides important context for understanding McAlpin's experience. Federal investigators have already found that Phoenix police engaged in discriminatory practices, particularly against people with behavioral health disabilities. The department's pattern of excessive force and failure to provide appropriate accommodations is not an aberration but a documented institutional characteristic. McAlpin's case is not an outlier, but an example of systematic dysfunction that affects countless residents of Phoenix who will never receive media attention or legal representation. The broader implications of this case extend to every disabled American who might encounter police. The failure to recognize deafness, the inability to accommodate cerebral palsy, the insistence on verbal compliance from someone who cannot hear. These failures are not unique to the officers who attacked McAlpin. They reflect gaps in training, policy, and culture that characterize police departments nationwide. Disabled individuals face elevated risk of police violence precisely because their disabilities may prevent them from performing compliance in the ways officers expect. The gap between police expectations and disabled reality is filled with violence. The racial dimension of this case intersects with disability in ways that compound vulnerability. Black disabled Americans face both the heightened suspicion that race triggers and the accommodation failures that disability creates. When officers approached McAlpin, they saw a black man they had been told was criminal. They did not see a disabled man who could not hear them. Their racial assumptions overrode any impulse to assess his individual circumstances. The result was violence that a white deaf man might have avoided. Though no disabled person is truly safe when police prioritize control over communication. The question of what training or policy changes might prevent future incidents like this one is complicated by the recognition that existing training and policy should already prevent such conduct. Officers are trained in de-escalation. They are trained in disability recognition. They are trained in proportional use of force. The problem is not absence of training, but failure to apply training when confronted with racialized assumptions about criminality. Policy changes that do not address the underlying bias that drove this encounter will prove ineffective at preventing its repetition. Tyron McAlpin survives, traumatized and fearful of the public spaces where he was attacked. His wife's observation that he is now afraid to walk the streets of his own neighborhood captures the lasting damage that police violence inflicts beyond physical injury. The psychological toll of being beaten by agents of the state, of being criminalized for one's own victimization, of discovering that constitutional protections evaporate in the face of armed authority. These injuries do not heal when charges are dropped. They persist as a permanent reminder that safety is contingent and justice is conditional. The case remains open as of the latest updates, with administrative investigation ongoing and civil litigation pending. The officers who attacked McAlpin remain employed, their careers thus far undamaged by conduct that would result in criminal charges for any civilian. The department continues to operate under the same leadership and policies that produced this outcome. The fundamental structures that enabled this violence remain intact, awaiting the next deaf man, the next disabled citizen, the next Black American who fails to perform compliance to an officer's satisfaction. The machinery of injustice continues to operate, pausing occasionally when public attention forces acknowledgement, but never truly stopping.